We're pleased and honored to have you here in the GEF GCF pavilion. It is very good also to have here a good panel of speakers, and also we have dignitaries here that will speak about the relevance of private investments and how GEF and the GCF, as the largest climate funds, can help in mobilizing climate support at the local level. That is the challenge now, and that is a question that all of us here in our different capacities are decided as well to address. And this event is part of that journey, addressing some of the key questions for us to be able to mobilize more private finance. Now also that we go into long-term strategic planning, we have heard from countries on their LTS, their NDCs, their NAPs. There is a need as well to see how different stakeholders come together. The private sector is key to get the level of finance that is required. We know that finance needs are around the trillions of dollars, and there is no one single source of finance that can address the climate challenge. So there is a need and a requirement to mobilize the private sector. GEF and GCF are uniquely positioned for that, given the fact that we have different strengths and we use different financial instruments. So now some of the questions that we'll have in front of us, and we'll have our panelists address them, are how we can complement one another when it comes to using financial instruments for catalyzing private investments. How can fund can scale up one pilot that has been developed and that has proven successful in mobilizing the private sector. But let's start without much ado, and we'll start now with some opening reflections by our distinguished speakers here. We have Mr. Jochen Flassbart, State Secretary of the German Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMC. Thank you so much for your reflections.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to be here to speak about how to scale up private finance, both for, let me add to, no? Is it? Can you hear me now? No. No.
State Secretary, let's try again.
Is that working? Wow. I have to be fast. Who knows how long it works? So it's about bringing the private sector into climate finance, and let me add to that also for biodiversity finance. We are heading after this COP a couple of weeks later to Montreal, and in Germany we count anyway climate finance and biodiversity finance in one bubble because it fits very much to each other. So let me start by looking first at the public side. And I worked with my dear colleague, former colleague in Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson, the former Minister for Environment in Canada, in my previous position when I was with Environment on the 100 billion delivery plan, and last year for Glasgow. And I learned a lot. And one part of that we failed to reach the 100 billion is certainly that we did not have enough public funding. But that was not the biggest problem. The much bigger problem is that we did not leverage enough private finance through the money we put on the table from our public budgets. The leverage factor we counted a couple of years earlier after Copenhagen were much higher than we achieved them. So my takeaway from that is, yes, it's right that we push our ministers for finance, and we do so constantly everywhere to give us more money. But even if we are successful, and these are specific, you have to make a lot of pressure to get something out of them. Even if we are successful, we will not achieve what we need to achieve. And the moderator just mentioned the trillions. To quote the IPCC, the global transformation of the energy sector alone needs up to 2.4 trillion US dollar by 2035. And there are other figures around from the high-level expert group on climate finance. They call for mobilizing 1 trillion by 2030 annually. So we are so far away from these numbers. And that is the reason why we need innovative instruments to get the private sector in. And we did not do well in the past. And what I saw is there are different obstacles. One is a mismatch between the expectation of investors and the requirement of climate finance. Has a lot to do with risk appetite. And to be clear on that, I think entrepreneurs, it's a genetics of entrepreneurship that they take risk. So I'm of the view that we do not need to take away all the risk from entrepreneurs. But there are some risks that cannot be taken by private investments. And there are a number of them. Look, for example, if you look at countries in fragile contexts, and unfortunately the number of countries, of fragile countries is increasing. So if you want to have investors going into these regions, then we need to find ways to de-risk their investments. We have other risks, currency risks, and others where we do have some good instruments at hand. And I expect from the financial sector, also including the GCF, GEF, our development banks, that they continue to be creative and find new and innovative solutions for specifically this de-risking of investments. This applies also for least developed countries and SIDS, where it's often difficult to, on the one hand, to enhance the capability of those countries to access global finance, climate finance, and on the other hand, sometimes it's difficult to find business cases. And this is even more the case when we turn from mitigation to adaptation. Mitigation, I think, if we are clever enough, mitigation should be the normal business case, and non-mitigation should not be a possibility to make money on this globe. So it has a lot to do with what kind of framework do we establish, what are the regulation we set in place. Just to give you an example, we launched today the JET with Indonesia. That builds upon the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. And if you now look into the details of the JET with South Africa, it has a lot to do with investments. So simply to increase their renewable energy installations. And we are working together with the South African government. If you set the right regulation in South Africa, a country privileged with sun and wind, there is no need for public finance. It's simply a question of the right regulation. If you look into other parts of the JET, for example, the just part, how to create the new jobs, not for the workers there. I mean, if you look at the lifetime of coal power plants and then the age of the workers there, it fits. But it's more about the kids of these workers. So the idea is how to create jobs for them. What do we need to invest in vocational training and all these things? And there is something you usually don't have a business case for. That is something where we do have to come in with public money. I think, and as my friend Carlos is now here, I think GCF and GEF can play a wonderful role in being the pathfinders for this kind of innovation we need. Specifically, GEF can come up with really innovative instruments, and GCF can match them or can look where are the best practices to scale them up. And that is, I mean, why we are anyway good friends of GCF and GEF, but why we believe that these two institutions are really sitting in the core of what is needed to reach another, not only level, another galaxy in bringing the private sector, the private investments in. I leave it with that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flashbart, for the opening remarks as well, and for your reflections about the importance of leveraging the private sector and the role that both GEF and GCF can have in mobilizing financial instruments that can help us in that respect. On that note, we would also like to hear from Dr. Gayan Gabrielian, Deputy Minister of Environment of Armenia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to me to be in the pavilion of GEF, GEF and GCF, but it's a more for me responsibility that I'm taking floor after you. It's not easy, you know. So thank you very much for your intervention. There is so many important things that you have already noted. But if you let me anyway, I will start from some reason that Armenia climate has already begun warming, and if carbon emission are not reducing, temperatures are projected to continue rising sharply. So if we take some notes, we need to understand that in the unmitigated scenario, reducing the time it takes for the economy to adopt the higher temperature from 30 to 20 years, and could reduce the impact on GDP about 1.7 percentage points and reduce public debt from 62 to 54% of GDP by 2072. And this requires investment. And when we talk about investment, we firstly want to understand where is the investment possibilities. So this is state budget, okay, but it's not enough because we all understand it's quite well that it's not enough. Okay, this is the foundations that we have, and I want to mention that Armenia is one of the in the region, the country that we have direct access to GCF, but still it's not enough because we're trying to coordinate all these procedures, because this is secondly about the capacity of project building. This is about concept node creation. This is about the possibility to get access to this money, because when there is a lot of money, but how we can go through these procedures to get this money and to go to targeting our procedures. So for us, that second institutional possibility, this is something that we all call PPPs, and Armenia has adopted the PPP law. But again, this is about trust that you have already mentioned. How can public can go with private sector to be honest and to get their trust, because they don't want to work with public, because they understand the bureaucracy, the old procedures they need to go through with us, with government sector, and it is not easy again. So how do we do this trust with private sector? This is very important for a country like Armenia, because we have huge history that private sector like saying, okay, I don't want to go to the tendering procedures, not PPP, not procurement, I don't want your budgeting money, your foundations, I want to go to my small business and want to do something, just leave me alone. This is a big topic for Armenia to understand how we can be interest for private sector. And again, when we talk about PPPs, and imagine that we will get this trust, but this is also not enough, because if we are calculating the money that we need to invest for our responsibilities, for our targets, we will never reach it, because we have the second issue as fiscal space. and we were discussing this a lot about how can country go through this fiscal space and fiscal responsibilities and fiscal capacity. If we will, okay, you will take as an opportunity, I need to take the loans because this is investment, we need to get these loans. But if I don't have this space, so I can do nothing with this. So again, this will ruin all my procedures. So we start to think a lot about how we can go through other financial tools. And this is also very interesting because when we talk about debt for climate, this is some type of financial tool to invest to this agenda. But also when we start to understanding if country with its country program, that is very important for everybody. But if we will be very clear with our country program and if we will get the leadership under this country program, I think this is very important to make the bridge under householding savings, because if you will be strong with your leadership, you will understand your country program, then you will open space for private, so they will be able to go through these procedures and get your strategy and your willingness of project, and private sector will do it better than we. We will be just like some light, then we'll go other and say, yes, this okay, you are doing great, you are doing great. But only thing that we need to go, just go away and give them this space. The space that then can be creative, but go through our targets, our responsibility, our country programs. In this edition, I just want to say that in Armenia, before country program accepting, we have more than 200 private sector negotiation discussions, because this is very important to hear them. This is not that we are not stronger, we lose our leadership, we lose the control, because the biggest problem of government members, I'm so sorry for telling this because I am the one of them, this is losing control. We don't want to lose control. That's why Ministry of Finance never want the foundations. And I think in all countries, when we talk about let's create some foundation, they say no, we have budgeting, we go through our budgets, and let's be clear, no other foundations. We are the biggest fund of our country. This is about control. They don't want to use control. And for us, this is a big issue to understand how we can be honest with Ministry of Finance in this border, and to create this bridge with private sector and keep the balance. I think balance is the key to understand that private will come to us and they will start to do what we want, but with their hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Gayan, also for indicating your views in relation to the relevance of country program and planning at the country level to send the right signals to the private sector. That's very interesting, and it's very good to learn on the perspective from Armenia. Many thanks. And thank you as well, Carlos Manuel, for joining us. It is a pleasure, of course, to have you as part of this opening panel. And it would be very helpful also for us to hear your views about the work that our organizations do, GEF and GCF, in leveraging private finance. Thanks.
Well, thanks, thanks so much, and the pleasure is mine. And to my right, I got two very important, relevant decision makers that reminds my previous slide before getting into the GEF. I was working in the government of Costa Rica, and one of my biggest challenges was how do I make the best out of the ODA and international funding opportunities. And many times I was puzzled. I was confused about how do I use the GEF resources, the GCF resources, bilateral cooperation. How do I engage myself in those system change investment with the multilateral development bank? And I was always confused on how do I do all of that. I knew for sure that the GEF was very good in helping me understand how to innovate approaches on land use change and forest conservation. How do I use forests as a way to develop rural opportunities and green jobs? And then, you know, the possibilities to really amplify, upscale things with the private sector and the GCF. I was always very confused. And for me, it's a real pleasure and honor now to be leading one of these funds in an effort where we have agreed to really work based on a long-term vision, not collaborating, complementing. And this means from thinking on co-investing in the projects all the way to really scaling up. And what we aim to today is to be able to go to different geographies where we can sit down with regions, countries, and we can plan 1 decade ahead of time. And this is a game changer of the things that we should be doing. Otherwise, we will continue coming here to the COPs to hear a lot of complaints and claims and lack of real traction, because this is the moment where we need to really be thinking on the how and sharing lessons on how we go from very nice aspirational NDCs into concrete political processes. Because here, when we see the countries, we get the wrong impression that these gentlemen, these ladies will go back to their countries and will change the political system. These are representatives of the executive branch, not the whole government. And they need us to support them in their effort for those political actions that will trigger the system change that needs to go through national congresses and parliaments. And this is a very important element that we need to really understand from the funding perspective. At the end of the day, the work that the GCF and GEF does in terms of co-investment, in terms of scaling up, in terms of sharing a common template so we can facilitate the work of access to the countries, needs to have a very clear vision. And the vision of our funds is to really contribute in the work that all governments needs to do, so all development policies help the full alignment of public and private investments with the Paris Agreement, with the CBD, new potential framework, and with the other multilateral environmental agreements. That way, we will have the private sector investing in the benefit of this convention as opposed to what we see today. So the GEF can be 10 times bigger, GCF can be 100 times bigger. That won't change. That won't change the production and consumption patterns of our countries. But the GCF, the GEF, with bilateral cooperation, can be key catalyzers of political processes that needs to go to national congresses and parliaments, whereby countries needs to align their investment policies, private and public sector, so they are all fully aligned with the international commitments. And that is a big challenge. Today, as we speak, all of our countries, from the east, the west, the north, and the south, all of the countries invest 140 times more financial resources in activities that destroy forests than what we invest in forest conservation. This is the best example of policy incoherence. Policy coherence means supporting countries through good data, the right political dialogues, so they can all agree and, under consensus on how we align our development policies with the Paris Agreement, the CBD framework, and the chemicals and land degradation conventions. And I think that the GCF and GEF are connecting the dots on how we can work that way, so we can have the private sector investing in sustainability instead of what we have today. A couple of weeks ago, I was really concerned by the news that the oil and gas companies are making the biggest profits of their lives. This is a very, very, very bad sign that we are needed to confront with. So we need to be able to help these countries in this effort to generate more policy coherence. We need to generate the proper political dialogues across sectors. And at the end of the day, our conventions needs to use this funding so they can aim to all the convention, bringing all sectors in a more integrated manner than what we have done today. So this is our vision within our funds. We got a very strong, clear mandate from our council and boards to walk in that direction. I'm extremely happy to be here once more in a climate COP, giving accounting for what the GCF and GEF has been doing in the last year. This is just the beginning of a new dimension of multilateralism and access to finance, and I'm really happy that this kind of very specific conversations is being taken within ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos Manuel, for your views as well on how the GEF and GCF collaborate in supporting countries and also in catalyzing private finance. And thank you very much, Mrs. Marta Delgado. Bienvenida. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel as well to provide the views of Mexico in relation also to how to catalyze climate finance and the role of GEF and GCF. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It is a privilege for me, and I thank the Green Climate Fund and the GCF for the invitation to the government of Mexico to reflect on this very challenging matter. It is a pity that we haven't had enough power to solve the financial challenge of climate change in the last 27 years. At least, because what we need really is just to organize a mechanism as a private sector organizes several mechanisms for other purposes. So I think that having these kind of reflections is very important in order for getting or speeding up the financing, but also the willingness of the private sector and financial institutions to participate and get engaged of the different activities that the countries needs to do in order for achieving the ambitious goals that we have set it up. So besides that the climate funds have been playing an essential role to offer these different platforms and options so the different countries can obtain meaningful support to develop and implement projects intended to have a positive impact in the reduction of GHG emissions, but also for the adaptation or for the resilience that we have to gain in cities or coastal areas. For Mexico especially is very interesting how to use these alliances or these coalitions or invitations for private sector to adopt public policies that Mexico have decided to undertake. In this regard, I would like to share with you that in order to keep developing effective climate solutions, the President López Obrador of Mexico and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, and the leadership of the Governor of Sonora, Alfonso Durazo, were instrumental to launch last week the Sonora's Sustainable Energy Plan. This is very important being said that it's a binational project for generation of renewable energy. So Sonora is the northern state of Mexico that is aiming also to export energy to the United States. So these, I think that the initiative would be fundamental for the economic development of our country and has the special characteristic of, first of all, maintaining the role, the leadership of the role of the state of Mexico, of the government in the project, but also having kind of opportunities for the private sector. In which sense? Well, in clean energy with the project to generate 5 gigawatts of photovoltaic energy in the state. The first phase is going to be in Puerto Peñasco, a mega solar plant. It's going to be the largest of Latin America. Second, also is important to mention that it is devoted for the development of human talent that is going to be very important for Mexico to replicate this experience in other part of the country. So we need to develop special personnel and existing research in the areas of electromobility that needs to be really very hard in Mexico in order for us to participate in this kind of economic challenge, and cutting edge infrastructure through development of science parks. This is also important in Mexico because we have a lot of universities, but also we need to strengthen the ability of scientific bodies in Mexico for generation of renewable energies. And also, well, finally, I have to share that the electromobility industry is going to be very important in our country. Semiconductors and building electric motors are going to be a couple of important economic activities in the country. So we will need a lot of support of course, the multilateral institutions, the banks, the multilateral banks, but the private sector and the talent, the scientists that can bring to a country that is full of lithium, for example, or we have an automotive industry. We are the fourth automotive builder in the world, but we need to transform and to evolve this industry into an electromobility or electric cars. Otherwise, a lot of infrastructure set it up in Mexico for building oil or gasoline or diesel cars in the country will be abandoned and obsolete very, very fast. So this is very, very new for us. I want to acknowledge our colleague from Sonora, Dr. Acuña. He's leading this effort in the state, and he's presenting this effort in other fora. And I want to also say to you that if you are interested in this experience or this pilot, we are very willing to collaborate with anyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister Delgado, for the views as well on the efforts that Mexico is undertaking as a country at the forefront of private sector engagement and also public policy to promote that engagement. And many thanks also for providing some specific examples and inviting us to learn more about the pilot in Sonora. Many thanks as well for your presence here. Many thanks, and I think we have all benefit for the remarks of this opening panel and also the insights that they have provided in terms of how we can jointly mobilize our collective strengths for private sector engagement when it comes to addressing climate change. We thank our opening panel, and please allow me to give a hand to them. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And now, thank you to all of you. Now we move to our discussion panel, and thanks to the panelists as well for coming to the stage here.
My pleasure. I invite.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now we're moving swiftly to our discussion panel. And of course, now they will build also on the remarks of the opening panel. So that will be very interesting. And they will be addressing some of the questions that we have for them and some of the examples as well that can shed light on how to move ahead. To start on that note, we have Mr. Craig Kogut, CEO of Pegasus Capital Advisors, and of course, one of the accredited entities to the GCF and also entity to the GEF that has a remarkable project that is the prime example of how the two institutions have come together in mobilizing their strengths at different points in time in support of one project that was initiated with the support of GEF and scale up with GCF support. Over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. So the project Carolina referred to is really a wonderful example of how the GEF and GCF can collaborate, and I think to be superseded, as was mentioned, by even a better model by talking and working collaboratively from the start. We've been accredited, as Carolina said, by GCF. To go back to this particular project, GEF put Lightsmith Capital and their craft fund on the map by giving them a grant, which enabled studies to be done. And this goes back a ways. This was a pioneering adaptation fund at a time. I think this may have been 2013 or 14, and at a time when no one was talking about adaptation and resilience, and our friends at GEF were doing that. That enabled a closing of $88 million, first close in their fund of $88 million. And I have a quote I want to read from my friend Jay Coe, who is the CEO of GEF, of Craft. His comment he sent to me today was, "GEF's support for Craft was critical to its success, and it is no exaggeration to say that without GEF's support, Craft would never have achieved a first close." So then what happened a couple of, years later, after the project was incubated, nursed, and after that first close, we were asked to be the accredited entity to receive capital from the GCF. The GCF was very focused on the important nature of this fund and as really a pioneer in adaptation finance. And we did that. GCF became the largest investor in the fund. And I think the fund was closed. The FAA was signed 4 months after board approval. And the capital was actually deployed in 6 months. So the GCF is the largest funder of this really pioneering fund we were proud to represent for GCF as the accredited entity. And let me maybe just, so I think it's a great example literally of collaboration. I'm losing track of time, I think it was Saturday, to give you a sense of how important this fund is. After President Biden was here, the next day there was a panel chaired by Samantha Power and Brian Deese. Some of you may have been there. And the moderator was Jay Coe, talking about the importance of adaptation. And again, GEF and GCF put this fund on the map. The US chose Jay to moderate a panel discussion focused on the importance of resiliency and adaptation. So I think it's a great example of how GEF can do things faster and the GCF can't. GCF can come in with catalytic blended finance as a junior capital provider. But to the point of how you can work better, I think what you were talking about in terms of GCF, GEF collaboration, just talking sooner, working together strategically as you suggested, I think would be wonderful. And I think as the recipient of 2 GCF fundings and as junior capital and 2 blended finance vehicles we have, and also with TA facility, I think that's my only suggestion, but you already have it. You're going to do it. So thank you.
Many thanks for those comments and remarks. That's a great example also of how we can have more of this on the way forward and replicate what has gone right when it comes to private sector engagement and to collaboration between institutions. Now we move ahead also with our panel, and we have Maggie Kim, CEO from Gold Standard. Thank you so much also for telling us about how Gold Standard provides assurance for investors and also your views on private sector engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Hello, everyone. It's that late hour of the day, and I love being part of a panel at this hour. So let me try to be brief and get to the points. So I've been a long-standing fan of GEF and GCF for many, many years, and GCF from the inception. And I've seen that transformation of the organizations in the context of private sector. And where I see that really picking up is in the last few years, where we started to see concrete examples. And thanks to Craig for his leadership, because I always call him a brave man. So as a private equity, to come to GEF and GCF and also involve a global impact standard, gold standard, we're notoriously known to be complex, difficult, hard to follow. and he got all those actors involved to make sure that his investment, his programs and initiatives actually deliver real impact on the ground with support from GEF and GCF. So I find this partnership really, really interesting. And if we can make it work, I think there's huge potential for replicability and scalability, because we need many of you, Craig, and many Pegasus. And those models need to continue to teach us what lessons we need to learn, how to simplify and make it easier for private sector, how to increase that capacity, and how to get the impact measurement, not as an ex post sort of let's audit what's happened, but really fully integrate it from the start of the fund, start of the program, or start of the project, and walk through the entire investment until exit to result in outcomes. And we're using taxpayers' money to create this blended finance. So we need to make sure that these are real, credible impact that we're delivering on the ground. So I'm really happy to be working with a great group of partners who are trying to figure it out, create best practice, and scale it as we go, and you know, build capacity in those countries who can deliver that, inspire private sector that it's not impossible and that it doesn't take that long. But on that note, as I've been in that partnership for the last year and a half, I want to stress one thing, is we all speak different languages. We all speak different decision-making processes, and we all have different cultures. So imagine an impact standard and an assurance body working with a private equity firm full of bankers to work out our language and our mission alignment on impact measurement. So it was pretty impressive this week to be sharing some panel discussions with Craig and his team to see how their language is changing and how they're considering impact in deciding which projects to invest in, deciding how to assess the feasibility outcomes, and how to implement those projects on the ground. So I will keep on working with the partners, and I think what GCF and GEF needs to do more systematically was been already sort of highlighted in earlier discussions, but I think we just need many of these examples that work and start replicating, promoting it, and bring it really to scale. So I look forward to seeing that going forward under your leadership, and of course with support from GCF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie, for that. That already demonstrates that following a gold standard is not straightforward. As you mentioned, it's a complex journey, but it's possible, it's doable, and should be replicated. Thank you so much for those words. Now we're heading towards the end of our panel discussion, and we have two more speakers. I would very much appreciate as well your reflections on the things that you heard and some of the insights as well on the messages communicated so far. And for that, I will invite first Mrs. Annette Winst-Maser, Head of the Climate Finance Division in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMC. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It's actually very close to our hearts. You've heard my Secretary of State speaking about the figures involved, what we actually need as investments to come through, and there's a big, huge task lying ahead of us. And we heard about one example like Kraft, and we're very proud investors in Kraft, and really curious to learn more about Kraft. And I think what when you talk about like, for example, you did, Honourable Minister from Armenia, about the policy environment, I think that's an absolutely crucial part, and that allows you to do things like that, to actually opening up the space for investments. And I thought that those were wonderful points you made. Another thing both the funds can do, GCF and GEF, are actually de-risking the policy environment, the concrete projects. And I've experienced that my hands-on in Brazil, where I worked for the last 4 years. We wanted to offer possibilities for investing in for private investors in energy efficiency projects. And every culture is different, like you said. Everybody speaks a different language. And it was so difficult to promote something that in Europe is already very established to a different environment and persuade people that this is a quite unrisky investment. So we need de-risking, not just financially, but also the environment needs to be there. We need to accelerate the innovative approaches, financing instruments that are actually suited to these markets. Is it okay with the squeaking noise? Yeah, okay, sorry. And also we need to strengthen domestic and international financial institutions, working with the national development banks, giving TA to those people who are actually doing the hard work. So I think those are extremely important elements to get it right. And then when you talk about division of labor between the two funds, and I might also like to add the CIFs, the climate investment funds, I think they're also doing excellent work in providing learning opportunities for everybody. That was the reason why they were set up originally. And I think a key factor for that is we heard scaling up could be one of the criteria for division of labor. But I think it's more complicated than that. And we had a wonderful talk, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago back in Washington, what complementarity can look like. It's not just scaling up really from GEF projects to GCF projects. It's also different instruments we can talk about. What sort of instruments in which situation actually makes sense, what sort of instrument is available from which fund, and also from bilateral donors potentially. And we can talk about different regions. We can talk about different experiences with individual actors. So it's really a mix of criteria that should come into question of division of labor. And this complementarity for us strategically as a large donor to both funds is actually one of the key factors for access to finance. And it was mentioned several times for many of the especially for the LDCs, access to finance is absolutely crucial. We need to increase the ease, how countries can access both funds, and for that complementarity in policies, in joint financing platforms, investment platforms, in strategic programming, etc., but also down to the same formatting for project applications. I mean, it's really sort of from the very strategic down to the very practical. And that's something we'd really like to see the funds do more, and in order to make it easier and faster to access finance. And finally, I was also asked to provide a couple of points about what we as a bilateral donor do, I mean, through KfW, as she said, very much actually the same things, just on a possibly slightly different and more bilateral, more political level. We really like to engage with the national institutions, building up capacity in national institutions. It's very important for us, but getting the framework right, getting the policies right. Carlos Manuel talked about right incentives, and that's something the governments need to do. And for us, that's one of the big, huge policy dialogue issues we are taking up with the governments in our bilateral cooperation. So maybe leave it at here, and thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Windmeister, also for noting some of the aspects that pertain to the division of labor between the funds and other financial institutions as well that have teamed up and that are partners to us as well in the financial landscape, and for noting also the bilateral engagement that you have and some of the aspects that you consider priority as well as we support countries in meeting their climate objectives with private sector participation. To continue on a high note, we move now to my colleague, Soji Omisore, Deputy Director of the Private Sector Facility of GCF, for his reflections. Thank you, Soji.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Carolina. It's good to hear the panel speak in terms of the various initiatives that the private sector can do. especially in relation to how the GCF and GEF can help to mobilize and catalyze that. But I think it's important that we take a couple of steps back and understand some of the challenges that they face, and as well as the challenges that even we GCF and GEF also face. I've heard a lot about financing, but the issue is just not a financing issue. We know that from a funding perspective, I think it's good to provide a kind of context. We GCF1 raised just about $10 billion, which seems like a lot. However, we know that in the private sector, the insurance companies, the asset management companies, the pension funds, they manage roughly about 95 to 100 trillion dollars, worth of assets under management. Less than 2 to 3% of that has been channeled, or is being channeled rather, to climate impact ESG opportunities. Within that, GCF and GEF are part of that, less than 3%. And even within that, we make up less than 2% of that kind of ecosystem. So it's important to have a context in terms of the challenges that we face and the magnitude of funding required for these opportunities. That's number one. I think in terms of the other consideration is in relation to deal flow. The private sector, obviously, we're looking to catalyze, bring funding in, but they have a different return expectation to ourselves. We are willing to provide concessional funding. What do I mean by concessional funding? We are willing to take a lower return in order to attract the private sector to come into projects within the climate space, right? We do not have any, we don't have a return expectation, but we're willing to take that lower return. The private sector, in some cases, maybe their return expectation is 12%, 15%, 10%, whatever it is. But by providing concessional funding, we are able to attract them. So the challenge is that they need to consider, and I don't like using the word, but I'll use it anyway. They need to consider the bankability. In our space, in development space, we call it viability of a project, right? Because ultimately, they, for example, for pension funds, they typically look for non-volatile annuity type returns. They do not want to take excessive risk because obviously they have long-term liabilities and they want to ensure that they have cash flows from their investments to meet those long-term liabilities, right? So they want consistent, non-volatile, i.e. not non-risky opportunities. I think it's important to have these in mind as we speak, because we're all speaking about getting the private sector involved, but for them to do that, we also have to kind of structure projects that enables them to feel more comfortable. The third thing is in relation to on the government side, a lot of the governments have kind of strategies, climate impact strategies, etc. In many cases, where they fall down is lack of what I call, investment opportunities. Investors, especially the private sector, as well as ourselves, we do not want to do kind of individual deals, by one by one. Scalability, I heard earlier on, is absolutely key. So we want to basically scale new opportunities, i.e. have a pipeline of transactions that large private sector investors, as well as the likes of GEF and GCF are able to invest in. So that's a kind of a third consideration. As we go forward, a lot of our projects in the past have been in the mitigation space. We're now looking at adaptation, and in terms of adaptation, we know that there aren't a great deal of kind of existing projects or opportunities. We need to create them. But the reality is that in many cases, we do not know what technologies will succeed and which ones will fail. So we need to go through what we call, kind of a trial, right? pilot. The reason for saying that is the type of funding required will determine the success or otherwise of a pilot. What we provide, GCF, we provide a kind of a menu of financial instruments. We provide equity, debt, guarantees, and grants, right? Debt is pretty much provided for existing entities, i.e., opportunities or projects that are already in existence and are generating cash flows in order to meet the debt payments, right? For innovation, that is not possible. For when I say, especially on an adaptation side, so the funding required for adaptation type projects are typically equity and grants. And we know that in many cases, the private sector is not willing to provide that early stage or that equity because for them, it's too early. So, the risk of failure is high. That's where we, ourselves, GCF and GEF, are able to come in order to provide, what we call junior equity. I'm not going to get into detail, but junior equity as well as grants in order to kind of kickstart, those projects. So it's important to have that in mind. I think one of the benefits that GCF provides is the ability to support projects at any level of the capital structure, whether it's debt, equity, what I say, sub debt or subordinated debt, junior equity, senior debt, etc. So because we are not a rated entity, we are more flexible in terms of the kind of funding that we're able to provide. Whereas on the private side, they are, in many cases, a lot of these financial institutions need to protect their credit rating. So that's a challenge for us. We are willing to take early stage and basically risk, which is absolutely paramount. I think lastly, in terms of kind of consideration, and it was talked about right at the start, is in relation to the political risk, right, or political / regulatory risks. That is a key consideration for the private sector. There are many risks that you're able to mitigate and many risks that you're able to price for. What is the challenging is the what I call the political and regulatory risks, because in essence, you're taking country or / government risk. For example, within infrastructure, an energy infrastructure, you have what they call PPAs, power purchase agreements, right? So that's an agreement between you, the project promoters and the government, right? In many cases, the PPA is, if you don't have a strong PPA, which controls many aspects of the project, as well as what we call the tariff, the price that you're charging per kilowatt hour. If you're not able to have something that the private sector is comfortable with, then in the energy space, that will make it more challenging. So I'm just highlighting some of these. It's not exhaustive, but I'm just highlighting some of the challenges that the private sector typically face, and for us as well, as well as for GEF, who provide mostly grant. Those are some of the challenges that we face. I hope I made myself kind of clear, and I hope I've put a viewpoint from the private sector perspective in terms of challenges that they face. Because we talk a lot about about financing, but this is beyond just the financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Soyi.
Okay.
That was very clear and also shed light with regards to the magnitude of the resources required. Also, how we can deploy our different instruments and how we can catalyze private sector through joint collaboration across our organizations. Thank you so much for that, Soyi. Now, also, as we close this panel, it's been very good as well for us to have here representatives of countries. We have the country perspective, so thank you so much for your participation, and also have agencies here, bilateral agencies, federal ministries, the two funds, and of course, accredited entities and implementing entities. It's been a very, very rich panel, and this is also indicating the value that we can provide in the financial landscape as GEF and GCF in terms of making sure that we use our reinforcing mandates and also our different strengths in supporting countries better and in being guided by countries as they plan and send the signals to the private sector to mobilize the trillions. We are there to assist countries in that respect, and that can only be deployed and realized to the support of all the stakeholders around the table and our panelists here as well. So thank you so much for that. We hope that you have enjoyed this event, and thanks for your time. We hope to continue seeing you in the GEF GCF Pavilion. Thank you.